Welcome back to the podcast. This is my seemingly never-ending TwoMorrows podcast. I had originally talked to John Morrow about, hey, let's get on the podcast and do a couple of shows. And at the end of it all, just about every single editor and some columnists decided to come on this show. And the last person I have on the show, not the least, but the last, is Eric Nolen-Weathington. I just said that like Elmer Fudd. Sorry, I butchered your name, Eric.
I've heard far worse.
He does the Modern Masters series for the most part at TwoMorrows. Eric, tell us your origin story. What got you into comic books and made you a lifelong fan?
All right, my first comic, I was 4. My dad came home with a Gold Key Sylvester and Tweety comic. And I was reading by the time I was 4, so I was able to read most of it. I had to ask him for help for a couple of the words, but it was pretty basic comic for kids. I didn't have too many problems with it, even at 4. But then what kind of sealed the deal was my kindergarten year. At that time, kindergarten was half day, so I had to spend the other half of the day with a babysitter. And she had 2 sons, one who was about to graduate high school, one who was about to start high school. And they had 2 giant stacks of comics, about the equivalent of about almost 2 long boxes worth of comics, and a bunch of treasury size too, something from that time period. So this would have been like 76, 77. And by the time I stopped seeing her, going to her, she decided that the boys were too old for their comics. So I got half of them, and the other person who stayed with her got the other half. So I came home with basically the equivalent of a long box worth of comics at the age of 6. And there was just everything in there. I'd say maybe only 25% of it was superhero. There was a lot of Archies, a lot of Harveys, a lot of war comics, just everything you can think of. And I read all of it. I read all of it multiple times. Read the covers off a few of them. So comics have been with me pretty much as long as I've been reading, and almost as long as I've had memories.
So tell the fans a little bit about yourself. Who are you outside of comic books?
Most of my career has been in the comic book industry, or I like to say on the fringe of the comic book industry. But before that, I've worked at newspapers. I did that for 11 years while working for TwoMorrows. I have a wife, 2 kids. My son is a history grad student. He just finished grad school. He's going into museum studies. Not a great time for it, with all the funding being cut. But my daughter's just halfway through college now.
So what got you into comic book history, and why should new fans really care about comic book history at all?
All right, so I was a 7 or 8. I'm not sure exactly. I think I was probably 8, maybe as late as 9, but probably 8. I think I had bronchitis and I was in bed for a week. So about halfway through that, one night my mom came home with the Golden Age of Comic Books, 1937 to 1945 by Richard O'Brien. And I don't know what inspired her to pick that up, of all things, but it had a brief essay, like maybe a 10-page essay on the Golden Age of Comics. It talked about the publishers, a lot of the artists. So it talked about Lou Fine, Will Eisner, and Alex Schomburg, and some others. And that's what really got me interested in the history of comics. And then the other thing too, I guess, related, was at the back of the Superfans Treasury Edition, which the babysitter's kids I talked about earlier had that as one of their treasuries. I didn't end up with that one, unfortunately. But at the back of it was a little thing with Alex Toth explaining animation. And that kind of ties into it a little bit too. Just that kind of behind the scenes knowledge of how things get done. And so with all, that's really where my interest lies. Since I picked up that Gold Age of comic books, I was probably the only 8-year-old who knew who the Green Flame was.
But why should the fan who just went and saw the MCU movie or the new Superman movie really care about comic book history at all?
For me, I like context for everything. If I know my car's messed up, I want to know the why and how. I don't necessarily just say just fix it, because you don't want to. So I like context with everything, and the history of the comics is what gives you that context. I don't really follow characters as a comic book fan. I follow creators. And that leads me to say, how do they get started in comics? Just those questions pop in my head when I'm reading their comics, no matter if I'm reading old stuff or new stuff. And I'm just curious about that kind of stuff. I'm not the only one. hopefully. And obviously I'm not, because people buy our stuff at TwoMorrows, but man, that's what it is for me, is if you're curious about how the stuff gets made, about who the people are behind it, and how that influences the stories that you love to read, you find that in comic book history.
So you started working at TwoMorrows back in 2000 as a production assistant. Is that correct?
Basically, yeah, I was the only staff member. We worked out of John's house. So I was downstairs. His office was upstairs. I had a little room in the back of the house. We were only there like maybe 4 or 5 years before they moved to the north side of town. But that's how it started. They were working on Streetwise. I don't know if you remember that book. It's one of the first books we did, where it was a collection of autobiographic short stories. We had Will Eisner and Evan Dorkin and just tons of artists. Barry Windsor Smith did a story for it. So for my first day on the job was getting some of the art that had just come in, and my job was scanning it. And I think I also, at some point in that process, I applied the digital gray tones to Paul Chadwick's story. And so that was like, okay, this is a cool job. I like this. And most of my job was just like answering the phone, taking orders, packing orders up, sending orders, dealing with the shipments when they came in, that kind of thing. That's the day-to-day, most of it. But there was also a lot of, I was proofreading everything at that point, everything we did. And the other big thing was, whenever I had free time, I was scanning the Xeroxes of Jack Kirby's pencils that we had borrowed from the estate. And so I was scanning hundreds of pages worth of stuff of these old Xeroxes, and try to do just like a initial cleanup on it. Not like John would. Some of the pages were in better shape than others, because that Xerox paper was, some of that paper wasn't great, and it was graying out pretty badly. But yeah, so that was what I was doing. And I did that I took a break. I was not in the office for a few years after my daughter was born, 3 or 4 years.
So your big breakthrough, if I'm correct, came in 2003 with that release of the first Modern Masters volume with Alan Davis. Is that correct?
Yeah, we had talked about a magazine before that, but it fell through, and I'm glad it did. It wasn't going to be exactly what I wanted to do anyway. The Modern Masters series came about because we had a comic book artist that was focusing on Silver Age kind of stuff. We had Alter Ego, which focused on Golden Age and some Silver Age stuff. There was a little bit of crossover there, but they were all interviewing the old guys. Reading some of those interviews, there are a lot of things those guys couldn't remember anymore. So my idea was, okay, we need to be documenting these guys who deserve to be interviewed, who have had careers but aren't quite as old as these guys. We need to interview them before they forget everything. So that was my thoughts.
How many have you done with the Modern Masters? How many have you been involved with and done? And are you going to keep doing that for a while?
Numerically, there's 30 volumes, but one of them we have not done yet, volume 23, which was meant to be the Darwin Cook volume, which I'm still holding out hopes that we will get it done at some point. I'm still on the radar with that one. I talk to them every now and then just to keep in touch and stay on. Marcia, his widow, is still archiving and going through all the artwork and seeing what's what and everything. I would need that kind of access to that before we could finish that book. But yeah, so the short story is 29 volumes. But I've also done other books outside of the Modern Masters books.
So how did you decide to put out a Modern Master? I mean, what was the criteria involved in putting them together?
All right, so my idea was modern meant anyone who came into the industry after Neil Adams, because he was that focal point where he was the kind of the transition point from the old guard to the new guard. He was kind of an anomaly when he broke in, because they weren't really many young artists breaking in at the time. For me, Masters meant you had to have at least 10 years in the business doing notable work.
So you felt like you were trying to also, part of the responsibility was to get these people's things again before they either forgot or in some cases died off.
Think about this. The Mike Wieringo book came out and he died 2 years later. So if I had put it off, we wouldn't have had that interview with him.
Do you have a problem separating between the fanboy and the person who loves comics and the comic book historian?
Not really. I think, like I said, I have that context, so I can compartmentalize those things pretty well. Getting to talk to some of the people I've gotten to talk with, there's a little bit of that, but not much. Even Nick Cardy, I did a book with Nick Cardy, and he was the guy that got me to buy a lot of comics, just because going back to those early comics that I was buying off the spinner rack, he did covers for a lot of them. Even though I didn't really know his name at the time, I could tell, oh, it's this guy, and I could recognize his artwork. And but he was such a sweet guy that there was no intimidation whatsoever as far as that goes. And that's the thing. Most of the people I've met and dealt with are just really nice people, and so there's really no issues with that kind of thing. I felt comfortable talking to all of them.
Do you have some dream projects that you're trying to accomplish or want to do one day that you haven't quite done?
There's the aforementioned Darwin Cook book. There's a couple of guys I try to get from Modern Masters who, for whatever reason, just didn't have the time or the inclination. There's some guys who just don't like talking about comics in that way. They just rather let the work speak for itself. And I've been disappointed a few times, but I've been pretty lucky. I've gotten to cover most of the people I'd like to cover. There's still others out there, but if I don't get to them, I feel like I've accomplished quite a bit as it is. So I can't feel too bad about it.
Do you think you can consider yourself a good comic book historian who's really done a great job and added to the wealth of knowledge for comic books in general?
I hope so. My automatic recollection is spotty. So if you ask me like numbers of issues, I might have to say, give me a second to look that up. And you hear a lot of stuff off the record over the years, and most of it you remember, but not all of it.
Do you have anything else coming in the near future?
We've got with Jim Amish, I'm doing the Jim Aparo book. Just finished writing it a couple months ago. The design's almost done. We're going to just get some clearances, and I might have to tweak a few things depending on those clearances. So that should be out in the fall at some point. I'm not sure. We don't have an exact date yet, but sometime in the fall. After that, I'm not sure. We might be doing a Lou Fine book, and I've done a couple other books with Jim. I did the Matt Baker book with Jim, and the Carmine Infantino, and the book we did. Jim's a good friend.
Also, like working with Jim Amish. Do you really enjoy working with him?
Yeah, like I said, I've known him since 2000. When I started working for the company, a month after starting working for TwoMorrows, I was running the booth for HeroesCon, at our booth at HeroesCon, and that's where I met Jim. And we've been friends since then. And so we've had lots of long conversations over the years, and so I talk to him whether we're working together or not. And so it's good working with someone you're comfortable with.
Is there a Modern Masters that you're especially proud of?
I won't say they're all equal per se, but they all have different qualities that I like. I think the Bruce Timm volume is probably my best interview, but I think the Guy Davis volume was the one the final product is exactly what I would like. I don't look back through it and say, oh, I wish I had changed this or whatever. And that's the one I was most satisfied with, probably.
Eric, before we wrap this up, you get the last word. Any closing thoughts?
Just like I said, if you like context for what you're reading, we're the place to come to. So I hope we can provide all the context in not just an informative way, but in an entertaining way as well.
Eric Nolen-Weathington, Modern Masters, among other things, one of TwoMorrows' biggest contributors. Thank you for joining me for the last TwoMorrows taping. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.